we are gathered here this morning to deal with a curious phenomenon which is confronting us. A barrage of statements on the situation in Sri Lanka has emanated from many Western capitals, in particular from Washington. We've seen statements from the State Department, from the embassy in Colombo, from Samantha Power, who was the former US permanent representative to the United Nations, and also from Mr. Jeffrey Feltman, who was the former Undersecretary General for Political Affairs at the United Nations. We also had interventions by the Brookings Institute and a range of others. We also have had to deal with statements from the EU, a number of other Western countries. Must also say that the UN also chimed in with this crowd, perhaps prompted by other Western countries. I describe this as a curious phenomenon, and there are a number of reasons for this. First, the situation in Sri Lanka has aroused a type of interest in the West that we have not seen being demonstrated or have given rise to a similar reaction in Western capitals. Secondly, as to why a domestic situation should create such an uproar in Western capitals, in Western embassies, in Colombo, is a bit of a mystery to me, because they don't seem to react in that same fashion in the case of other countries going through even more complicated circumstances. The US Embassy in Colombo has called on the President to respect the country's democratic traditions and the rule of law. Very important, democratic traditions and the rule of law. The EU has called on the President to respect democracy and recall Parliament immediately. We have also heard similar statements being made in the UK House of Commons. The ostensible underlying theme of all these interventions appears to be the need to protect democracy and advance democratic traditions. We all must do that. We have no problem with that, protecting democracy and advancing democratic traditions. Sri Lanka, after all, is the oldest democracy in Asia. It is a country that has enjoyed universal adult suffrage for the longest period of time. And this is also the country where elections have been held on a regular basis and governments have changed and changed peacefully. So when it comes to upholding democratic traditions, upholding democracy, it is very difficult to say that Sri Lanka is not doing that. And of course, the fact that the government, the President took certain measures starting on the 26th of October appears to have activated these Western embassies and Western foreign departments of foreign affairs. I also think that there are other reasons that have compelled these countries and their missions to act in this manner. An interesting question is what has provoked this interest, almost tantamount to intervention in the domestic affairs of this country, which is also clearly contrary to normal diplomatic practice, and one might even suggest accepted legal norms in the international community. One could also say that the clear elements that are promoting these statements, these interventions in Washington are the elements described by some people as anti-Trump elements. One of the persons Samantha Power, is very well known for her anti-Trump views. And she has even suggested that the West take targeted sanctions, impose targeted sanctions on Sri Lanka and the Sri Lankan leadership. As to the basis on which she has suggested this remains unclear to me because it has not been explained. Jeffrey Feltman, who was a former ambassador of the US, and as I said earlier, a former Undersecretary General for Political Affairs at the United Nations, has suggested a preemptive diplomacy-type UN intervention for conflict prevention. As a former Undersecretary General, he should know better that the United Nations does not get involved in domestic situations willy-nilly. There are certain procedures to be followed, and it is with great reluctance that the UN does get involved in a domestic situation. Both have alluded to the fact that there is a possibility of violence and chaos in this country. Now, I will deal with that in a moment. In Sri Lanka, we have seen when the Prime Minister changed and new Prime Minister was appointed on the 26th of October, there was no suggestion of violence. There was no suggestion of a descent to chaos. On the contrary, there was massive celebrations. There were fireworks all over the country, including in Jaffna. Almost on every street that you could drive along, you could see people distributing kiribat, milk rice, to each and sundry. If that is violence, that is chaos, then we need to redefine and think of a name, a meaning for the word violence and chaos. Another point that I need to make is related to the earlier point, is that the West does not appear to have intervened in this manner in a number of similar situations that occurred in the recent past around the country. We did not see the West intervening to criticize the changes of government that happened following the Orange Revolution in the Ukraine. An elected president was forced out of office by public demonstrations, but we did not see interventions of this nature. We also saw what happened in the Middle East following the Arab Spring. Again, did we see interventions of this nature? No, we did not. Why is it that Sri Lanka has become the focus of all this attention? There must be something more than the simple need to protect democracy or advance democracy. I also suspect that when things happened on the 26th of October, many Western countries and their embassies in Colombo, high commissions in Colombo, were wrong-footed. They did not expect this change to happen. They were living in a world of their own where the former Prime Minister, Mr. Wickremesinghe, would continue in office, whatever happened to the country. And they had enough time to deal with the emergence of the Rajapaksas between now and the elections which should have been held in in 2020. So they were banking on the fact that there was time to prepare for that in whatever form, and they were suddenly caught off guard when the president intervened and appointed Mr. Mahinda Rajapaksa as the new prime minister. So the way they have reacted is sudden, and this may explain the gaps in their logic, the gaps in their reasoning, and the gaps in their justification. I would suggest that under the circumstances, it would be better for these Western countries to try and work with the new dispensation to deal with the new administration in in a constructive manner rather than in a negative manner. I understand, and I am not exactly certain about this, that yesterday's press conference, press briefing conducted in the foreign ministry did not attract the number of high-level Western representation as had been expected. I think this is sad, it's disappointing that these ambassadors and the High Commissioners did not attend this briefing, because Sri Lanka will work in a proactive, in a friendly manner with the West. Sri Lanka will continue to deal with the West as if they are our friends. And they are our friends. Many people in the West, many leaders in the West are Sri Lanka's friends. And we will continue to adhere to that approach. I think it is childish and churlish for certain ambassadors, perhaps under instructions from the capitals, to try and ignore the reality. The reality is that in response to whatever was happening on the ground, the president has taken steps to appoint Mr. Mahinda Rajapaksa as the prime minister. That is the reality, and they need to work with that reality. And that reality has been grounded on good reasons. The country was in a mess. The economy had reached a point which it had never reached, even during the worst days of the terrorist-inspired conflict. The stock market was following a downward spiral in an unstoppable manner. Of course, not to talk about the currency. The currency reached a point that from which it might be very difficult for it to recover. The unemployment situation, the average person was suffering because of the economic burden. And then on top of it, the president and the prime minister appeared to be at loggerheads. They were openly criticizing each other, and nothing could be done. Nothing was being done. So I think as a reasonable person, the president took this measure to appoint Mr. Mahinda Rajapaksa as the new prime minister. This is the reality which has been grounded on facts that were available in Sri Lanka, in the countryside. There was widespread disenchantment, and the president reacted to that disenchantment by appointing someone with whom he could work and whom he thought would be able to deal with the problems that were confronting the country. On the other hand, he could have just waited for another 1.5 years, and you can imagine what would have happened here. Things were not good, things were terrible in the country. There was no confidence in the business community. And then we have the new situation. Of course, Mr. Wickremesinghe has refused to accept this. He's holed up at Temple Trees. Again, and can say nasty things about it, but I won't. What we need now is a constructive engagement by the West with the new dispensation, with the persons who are now in the driving seat. And then, of course, you may want to know whether the president was justified in doing what he did. I'm sure he received excellent advice, legal and otherwise, to justify his actions. At the moment, the matter is being discussed in the Supreme Court, so I'm not going to comment on it. As they say, it's sub judice, so let the judges decide whether the president took the appropriate steps given the circumstances. On an international level, I find that the current spate of interventions in our domestic affairs is ungainly and unacceptable. It is not consistent with contemporary diplomatic practice. One might even argue that it is illegal under international law. But of course, we are a small country, and everybody passing by wants to take a pot shot at us. It's very important that we maintain our stance, maintain our position that it is essentially a domestic issue that we are dealing with, and it's for us to sort ourselves out. It is not for outsiders, however well-intentioned they are, to tell us what to do. If we make a mess of it, well, it's our problem. And I'm sure we are not going to make a mess of it. We haven't in the recent past, and certainly not since independence. And we will make something out of it. We will come out of it without leaving a mess all over the floor. Another point that has been repeated time and time again, especially in the Western media, is that Mahinda Rajapaksa is a Chinaman. As we know, physically he's not a Chinaman, but he has been referred to as a Chinaman. It's very important to remember that Mr. Rajapaksa, despite the fact that he took considerable financial assistance from China for development purposes, did so after actually approaching many countries who are also our friends. He was not successful when he approached those countries. Man, he was in a hurry. He wanted to develop the country. This country had suffered for 27 years because of terrorism. Rajapaksa put an end to that nightmare of terrorism, and then his next objective was to develop the country. And to develop the country, he needed the financial resources. As I said before, he approached other countries who may have been in a position to help him, but the assistance that he had anticipated never materialized. So he turned to the one country that was in a position to do so. And China had been a friend of Sri Lanka for a long while. In fact, one could argue that China is not a friend from yesterday, but a friend from thousands of years back. And then you can see the results of all those funds that were deployed in Sri Lanka. We have the roads, the airports, the harbors, etc. There was a dramatic change to our economic environment, our physical appearance, because of the funds that came from China. There is also the other allegation of the debt trap. I'm not going to get into that because others have dealt with it comprehensively. But it is very important to remember that Rajapaksa did not turn to China willy-nilly. He did that after considerable thought, being given to the issue, and then certainly after approaching other countries, including our neighbor India, for assistance. And then finally, a comment on for those who are lamenting the decline of the democratic processes in this country. We had an impasse. We had a problem in the parliament. The Prime Minister and the President could not work with each other, and they were both complaining about it in public. Parliament had almost ground to a halt. There was nothing happening, and the economy of the country was in a really sad state.